Today is Friday, December 15th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. A day or so ago, a friend commented on my private blog. If you've never been to my private blog, it's at wcm.classicalliberarts.com. wcm.classicalliberarts.com. I use that as a place to post my own thoughts and comments, especially now because I'm no longer on social media. I like to do a little longer form content than the usual mindless social media posts. And I also like to keep it separate from the Academy website just because it's my own personal reflections and content that doesn't necessarily need to be any of the business of the Academy families. But if you go to wcm.classicalliberarts.com, I talk about all kinds of stuff related to classical studies, Catholic life, current events, and so on. But a friend recently commented because I wrote a post about gravity, and I know that in modern circles, anyone who even suggests anything other than the ignorant, popular mantras of modern science is treated like he's immediately some kind of clown, because most people who do that are clowns. But I was talking about how irrational it is the way we talk about scientific things like the force of gravity. And what prompted me to talk about that was I was making an exam for a biology course that we have in the Academy, and I was reading a passage, and it was mentioned that we know of the force that is called gravity. And I stopped there and I said, why would students who are just being introduced to biology, why would they be assumed to know that anything like a force of gravity exists? And you see this method of pressuring kids into thinking that these things are unquestionable. This idea that there is actually a force of gravity. Not that gravity is just a way to explain what happens, but that there actually exists a force called gravity. So God actually created something called gravity. And kids are made to feel like this has always been understood, or it has been demonstrated. And the truth is, if we're willing to be honest, no such thing has ever been demonstrated. And the whole idea of the theory of gravity, like most of the modern contradictions of Aristotelian natural philosophy, they're based on statements that really don't make any sense. And I'll give you an example, and I gave this example in that post that I wrote. If one questions the theory of gravity and says, prove to me that gravity exists, prove that a force actually exists, how would one do that? How would one actually prove that a force exists? Well, I would say we should start by taking a look at the definition of force. What is a force? Because if we don't start with the definition, our demonstration may actually make no sense. A force is some form of energy that causes some physical thing, some body, to move from its initial state of rest. So what will happen when we talk about gravity is someone will say, well, I'll demonstrate the force of gravity for you. And they'll bend down, pick up a rock, hold it up in the air, and say, watch, when I let this rock go, the force of gravity will force it to move downward. And if I pick this rock up 1,000 times, if I pick this rock up 1,000,000 times, the force of gravity will pull it downwards or move it downwards every time. And they can pick up the rock and let it go, and it will move downward. And they can do it again, and it will move downward. And they can do it again and again and again, 1,000,000 times. And every time, it will move downward. And they say, see, that demonstrates the existence of the force of gravity. But it does no such thing. It demonstrates no such thing as a force of gravity, and I'll explain why. Force is defined, as I said, as an energy that causes something to move from its initial state of rest. The initial state of rest of the stone was on the ground. The stone was in a state of rest, resting on the earth, because that's its natural place. It's what Aristotle would classify as earth. And if left to itself, it will move towards the center of the earth. And that's where it was. And then the man actually exerted a force by picking up the rock and moving it from its resting place. The force that was exerted by the man. The stone was moved from its resting place by the man. And when he held the stone out in the air in front of him, he continued to exert force upon that stone to keep it from its initial resting place. And when he let the stone go, a force did not then begin to act on an object in a state of rest. The force that was keeping the object from its state of rest was no longer applied, and once the force was removed, the stone returned to where it was taken from. In that whole transaction, the only force that was demonstrated was the force exerted by the man picking up the rock, moving it away from its original resting place, then holding it there by a continued application of force, and then finally freeing that stone from that force. So that activity, that demonstration, does not in fact demonstrate anything about any existence of any force of gravity. And yet, that's how it's presented, and we're asked to imagine that this demonstrates that a force of gravity exists. In that article I posted, I shared a link to an article on Forbes.com where someone was writing, explaining how the theory of gravity is proven. And he admitted in the article that there's no way to demonstrate the theory of gravity. There's no way to demonstrate it. And he said, what we do is we simply show the effects of it. But this is a circular argument, because we're assuming the existence of what it is that we're supposed to prove. And then we're using that assumption as both the argument and the conclusion. That's circular reasoning. And he jokes in this article, the author jokes in the article that, we could say, if we wanted to, that there was a band of invisible pixies or spirits, and when we released the stone, the pixies carried the stone back down to the ground. And that would also provide an explanation really of equal merit with the explanation that some force called gravity pulled it down. And he's sort of laughing at that. And as I'm reading that, I'm saying, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what's true. Someone could say that a group of pixies, a band of spirits, carried the rock down to the ground, and it would be just as clearly proven as this force of gravity. But then the author says, well, the difference is that Occam's razor tells us that the simplest explanation is the best, which again is another unjustified assumption. And therefore, since the force of gravity is a simpler explanation than a band of pixies, scientists favor the explanation of the theory of gravity. And that's the argument. Now the problem I have is that this reference to Occam's razor, I think, is misleading. And here's what I think has happened with Occam's razor. If we are to grant this principle that the simplest explanation is the best, then the explanation will have to actually prove to be the simplest. And what I believe happened back in the 1600s was that the Ptolemaic or Aristotelian understanding of the universe was considered to be pretty complicated. And the heliocentrists, people like Copernicus and Galileo, these modern scientists who based their arguments on supposedly the scientific method and reproducible experiments, observations, I think that they were confident at the time that if natural philosophy was freed from the authority of the church and the authority of Aristotle and scholastic philosophy, that their observations and experiments would lead to simpler explanations which would be supported by Occam's razor. And in the beginning, I think that their observations did that. And it gave an appearance that they were establishing an equally certain and more simple explanation of natural phenomena. But over time, I believe that the continued investigation, the continued observation has shown that much of what they've said is false. Much of what they had said is overly simplified and actually is not supported by continued observations. And so today, 400 years later, men continue to tear apart the world and dig into the universe to try and find the truth by means of observation. And it's not getting any clearer. In fact, the explanations are becoming even more complicated. The more we dig, the more complex things get. The more we search, the further and larger the universe and its objects become. And so that initial appearance that the conclusions of the Baconian or inductive philosophers, the appearance that they were establishing an equally certain and more simple explanation of things has actually proven to be false over time. And as the complexity of scientific explanations, as the complexity of magnitudes and multitudes is proven to be infinite, which is what the philosophers said, as scientists learn the hard way that what they like to pretend the philosophers thought is not actually what the philosophers did think or taught, sure would have been good if they took time to study the philosophers and make sure they understand them before they assume that they've already surpassed their understanding, because what's being discovered by all of this experimentation is that the ancient philosophers were right about some important things. First of all, they were right that material things, if examined, will simply continue to infinity, and therefore they cannot be examined in a scientific way. That's why the philosophers were not digging into what they called individuals. Pythagoras and the ancient mathematicians explained that magnitudes, which are bodies, can be divided to infinity, and multitudes can be multiplied to infinity, and therefore these cannot be the subject of science, but rather attributes which participate in material bodies, they are appropriate objects of scientific investigation, of contemplation. That's the principle that modern science has abandoned. And now as we watch modern science pretend like they're uncovering all the mysteries, when in reality they're just digging into deeper and deeper complexities, we're finding that Occam's razor in 2023 sides not with the material scientists, but with the Aristotelians. The Aristotelian explanation, as it stood 800 years ago in scholastic circles, or we could even say 2,400 years ago in Aristotelian circles, is a simpler and equally certain explanation of the natural world. And as modern science becomes more and more complicated, and we can be sure that it's becoming more and more complicated by the fact that it leads most people to agnosticism rather than any kind of scientific knowledge. It's actually proving, if we actually obtain increasingly accurate knowledge of the material world, it's proving that attempts to explain things materially is not only more complicated, but we don't know if it will ever stop becoming more and more complicated. And so the reality is, historically, modern science has created and is continuing to become more and more complicated as an explanation of natural phenomena. And the Aristotelian explanations, which are equally certain, are being proven to actually be more simple. And so I think Occam's razor in 2023 actually sides with Aristotle. A good example of this increasing confusion and complexity in modern science can be seen in what's happening to atomic theory. The idea that physical bodies are composed of indivisible particles, which are named atoms because the Greek word actually means that which cannot be divided. It was originally thought, in the typical overly simplified way of scientists, it was taught that the atom was the ultimate particle. It was the indivisible part which would prove to be the principle of all material substances. And again, it was named atom because it was said to be indivisible. And yet today, we find this perplexing attempt among scientists to go beyond the atom and talk about the parts of the atom, which just makes no sense. The language doesn't even make sense. To say we're going to talk today about the parts of an indivisible particle should cause everyone to stop. But science doesn't even pay attention to the language. They just plow ahead and pretend that as long as they continue to act confidently and scoff at any objections or questions, the majority of people will just go along because they're certainly not going to ask any questions. But now we talk about protons and electrons and neutrons and quarks and who knows what else. What we're seeing is the original explanation, which claimed to be superior to an Aristotelian explanation because it was simpler, is actually becoming more complicated, and it's just being allowed to get away with that. And whereas atomic theory was a nice, simple explanation, scientists know that that nice, simple explanation is actually not true. And yet they continue to appeal to Occam's razor as if they continue to have the simpler explanation. And again, that's simply not true. And science is allowed to get away with this. Decade after decade after decade, every kid is pushed into all of the modern courses, biology, physics, chemistry, where they learn an overly simplified and actually false natural philosophy that makes them think that the ancients were fools who didn't understand simple things. They lose all confidence in the ancients because they're told what the ancients believed by people who have never studied the ancients. And they go into their adult life just absolutely indoctrinated by modern scientists, modern science teachers, I should say. And they never look back. And they think that anybody who looks back is crazy. And this is part of the problem with modern education and why I often raise objections to modern science, because the kids are not studying scholastic philosophy, which was approved by men like Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great, who, believe it or not, were pretty smart men. But modern Catholic kids don't even know who they are, don't even read a page of their writing, because they're memorizing contents of textbooks contents that aren't even true. And let's just think about how obvious the falsehood of the modern teaching is. I'll give you an example. Kids are told that Aristotle and everyone before modern chemists like Lavoisier, who I'm pretty sure lived in the 1700s, kids are taught that the ancients and medieval people believed that the world was composed of 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. And then after being told that ancient people believed that there were 4 elements, fire, air, water, and earth, kids are then shown the modern periodic table, where they see, I don't know how many because the number changes, over 100 elements that they're told scientists have discovered. And so we've got a very simple argument here. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas said that there were 4 elements, but when modern scientists started actually looking at the world, rather than just believing what Aristotle or the church told them, they found that there were over 100 elements. And these are so obvious. And we look at the periodic table and we see the names of the elements, and it's like, well, no duh, right? I mean, one of the elements is gold. One is silver. One is lead. One is iron. One is sodium. One is carbon. Who would possibly deny the existence of these different substances? And so the kids are actually made to think, or asked to think, that Aristotle didn't know that gold and silver were different substances. That all he knew was earth. So he wouldn't have understood that earth was composed of gold and silver and lead and iron and carbon. He wouldn't understand that. He actually only thought that there were 4 elements. Now, does anyone actually think that Aristotle, when he said there were 4 elements, fire, air, water, and earth, does anyone think that when he said that, he was not aware that gold and silver and iron and lead and carbon existed? Does anyone think Aristotle didn't know about gold or silver? All he knew was earth, and I suppose that means dirt. He probably didn't even know about stone either. All he knew was fire, air, water, and earth. Now, either that's what Aristotle thought, or when he was talking about the elements and named 4 elements, he wasn't talking about the same thing that modern chemists are talking about. Which one of those 2 options do you think is more likely? That Aristotle didn't know about gold and silver, or that Aristotle was talking about something else and is being misrepresented by modern science teachers and made to look like some kind of crazy person? We can see what the schools do, and the effect that it has on the kids is that it leads them once and forever away from true philosophy, once and forever away from scholastic philosophy, because they think you've got to be crazy to believe what Aristotle taught. And they just laugh. They laugh because they have these ancient wise men caricatured like some wackos. And this is what the schools do. This is the effect of the school on the learning of modern students. The ancients, whom they have never studied, are misrepresented and mocked. And modern scientific teaching, which is not even true, but is overly simplified just to provide content for high school classes, is presented as so obvious and clear. And we're allowing teachers to do this to our kids, to Christian kids. From demonstrations that gravity is real, which make no sense, to explanations of what Aristotle taught relative to the periodic table, which is also false. And even if we dig into things like the periodic table, we find that a portion of those so-called elements do not even exist naturally. Well, that's another monkey wrench in this system. We're talking about natural science. How can an element not exist naturally and be called an element of nature? That doesn't make much sense. And moreover, when you see this list of the so-called elements and you ask, what are the quantities in which these different substances actually exist in the natural world, you find that there are 4 or 5 that have significant quantity in nature, and most of them scarcely exist. And if this is true, why are we making such a big deal about this periodic table? Why are we making such a big deal about the number of elements and all of these topics in modern chemistry classes? The reason is we're just trying to erase the knowledge of scholastic philosophy from the human mind, from educational history, trying to make it appear ridiculous and foolish, ignorant and superstitious, so that no one will ever read it again. And it's very effective. And it's not just unbelievers who do this. We can't just get upset because unbelievers are using taxpayer money to lead students away from scholastic philosophy. Catholic schools do this. Christian homeschool parents do this. Homeschool publishers are doing this. And a whole society of undiscerning knuckleheads won't even pay attention or ask a question when things that are obviously not reasonable are presented to them, because they're so afraid of secular society. But it doesn't make any sense. And so I wrote about that the other day, on whether the force of gravity exists. And as I said, you won't find any demonstrative proof that gravity exists. And when you ask for it, the scientists will roll their eyes at you and they'll scoff at you as if modern material science and the scientific method has no obligation to demonstrate its theories. They'll roll their eyes as if the scientific method is not about demonstrating the truth of theories. And they'll even twist it to put the burden of proof on those who question their theories. They'll say, well, have you proven it false yet? As if that's how the scientific method works. That article that I mentioned on the Forbes.com site, and there's links to it on the article, it actually says that the value of a theory does not depend on its actual demonstration, but on the continued failure of opponents to prove it to be false. And what I ask is, when did Francis Bacon ever suggest any such thing, that a theory in the scientific method is to be considered innocent until proven guilty, rather than untrue until proven true by experimentation, by reproducible experimentation? That's the whole point. That's the whole point of the scientific method. We're supposed to propose a theory, an answer to a question, and then test to see whether the theory is true. And if we cannot demonstrate that it's true, then we continue to refer to it as only a theory. And what a theory is merely a hypothesis. It's an educated guess. It's a guess. And so no one should talk about it as a fact or a law. We should say, this is such and such a person's guess as to why this does this or that. And it's never been proven. And anyone who objects to it, anyone who refuses to accept it, should not be scoffed at or treated like they're crazy, but they should be seen as being reasonable and scientific. And yet we don't find this at all in scientific circles. We find the opposite. And this is the kind of thing that I raise objections to, because I'm going to go to my grave arguing that every day that you don't begin studying scholastic philosophy is a day that you remain separated from a true understanding of the world. The longer that you continue messing with modern science from school textbooks and classes, and allow science teachers to tell you what's true and false, rather than studying the wisdom of the ancients, which is the only thing that's ever been commended to you by church fathers or doctors of the church, you remain separated from true philosophy. And as I said, I'm going to go to my grave preaching that. And I can provide examples like this again and again that show this irrational character of modern science. And this is what led me to actually give up modern science when I was a college student and pursue classical studies, because I saw these things. Even when I was a kid, I could see these things in my classes. These things don't make any sense. They're not true. We're not getting closer to certainty. We're simply agreeing to say the same thing for the sake of saying the same thing. And I didn't have any interest or motive to do that. So anyway, I strongly recommend that you start reading Aristotle's philosophy, his treatises on the philosophical sciences. They're all available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'm going to be teaching them. I recommend you read the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, where none of these things are doubted or questioned by one of the wisest men to ever live. And as a Catholic, I encourage you to trust men like St. Thomas rather than high school science teachers, because the damage that these high school science teachers are doing is really incalculable. And the parents, Catholic parents, are just feeding their children into this fire. And it seems that no one is willing to even ask a question.